Chapter 4 of Pioneers of France in the New World. Part 1. Huguenots in Florida. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James O'Connor. Pioneers of France in the New World by Francis Parkman. Part 1. Huguenots in Florida. Chapter 4. Laudonniere, 1564. On the 25th of June, 1564, a French squadron anchored a second time off the mouth of the River of May. There were 3 vessels, the smallest of 60 tons, the largest of 120, all crowded with men. René de Laudonniere held command. He was of a noble race of Poitou, attached to the house of Châtillon, of which Coligny was the head, pious, we are told, and an excellent marine officer. An engraving purporting to be his likeness shows us a slender figure leaning against the mast, booted to the thigh, with slouched hat and plume, slashed doublet, and short cloak. His thin oval face, with curled moustache and close-trimmed beard, wears a somewhat pensive look, as if already shadowed by the destiny that awaited him. The intervening year since Ribot's voyage had been a dark year for France. From the peaceful solitude of the River of May, that voyager returned to a land reeking with slaughter. But the carnival of bigotry and hate had found a pause. The Peace of Amboise had been signed. The fierce monk choked down his venom. The soldier sheathed his sword, the assassin his dagger. Rival chiefs grasped hands, and masked their rancor under hollow smiles. The king and the queen mother, helpless amid the storm of factions which threatened their destruction, smiled now on Conde, now on Guise, gave ear to the Cardinal of Lorraine, or listened in secret to the emissaries of Theodore Beza. Coligny was again strong at court. He used his opportunity, and solicited with success the means of renewing his enterprise of colonization. Men were mustered for the work. In name at least they were all Huguenots. Yet now, as before, the staple of the projected colony was unsound. Soldiers, paid out of the royal treasury, hired artisans and tradesmen, with a swarm of volunteers from the young Huguenot nobles, whose restless swords had rusted in their scabbards since the peace. The foundation stone was forgotten. There were no tillers of the soil. Such, indeed, were rare among the Huguenots, for the dull peasants who guided the plough clung with blind tenacity to the ancient faith. Adventurous gentlemen, reckless soldiers, discontented tradesmen, all keen for novelty and heated with dreams of wealth, these were they who would build for their country and their religion an empire beyond the sea. On Thursday, the 22nd of June, Laudonniere saw the low coastline of Florida, and entered the harbor of St. Augustine, which he named the River of Dolphins, because that at mine arrival I saw there a great number of dolphins, which were playing in the mouth thereof. Then he bore northward, following the coast till on the 25th he reached the mouth of the St. Johns, or River of May. The vessels anchored, the boats were lowered, and he landed with his principal followers on the south shore, near the present village of Mayport. It was the very spot where he had landed with Ribot 2 years before. They were scarcely on shore when they saw an Indian chief, which, having espied us, cried very far off, "Antipola! Antipola!" and being so joyful that he could not contain himself, he came to meet us accompanied with 2 of his sons, as fair and mighty persons as might be found in all the world. There was in their train a great number of men and women, which still made very much of us, and by signs made us understand how glad they were of our arrival. This good entertainment past, the Paracousi chief prayed me to go see the pillar which we had erected in the voyage of John Ribot. The Indians, regarding it with mysterious awe, had crowned it with evergreens, and placed baskets full of maize before it as an offering. The chief then took Laudonniere by the hand, telling him that he was named Satouriona, and pointed out the extent of his dominions, far up the river and along the adjacent coast. One of his sons, a man, perfect in beauty, wisdom, and honest sobriety, then gave the French commander a wedge of silver, and received some trifles in return, after which the voyagers went back to their ships. "I praise God continually," says Laudonniere, "for the great love I have found in these savages." In the morning the French landed again, and found their new friends on the same spot, to the number of 80 or more, seated under a shelter of boughs, in festal attire of smoke-tanned deerskins, painted in many colours. The party then rowed up the river, the Indians following them along the shore. As they advanced, coasting the borders of a great marsh that lay upon their left, the St. Johns spread before them in vast sheets of glistening water, almost level, with its flat sedgy shores, the haunt of alligators and the resort of innumerable birds. Beyond the marsh, some 5 miles from the mouth of the river, they saw a ridge of high ground abutting on the water, which, flowing beneath in a deep strong current, had undermined it, and left a steep front of yellowish sand. This was the hill now called St. Johns Bluff. Here they landed and entered the woods, where Laudonniere stopped to rest while his lieutenant, Ottigny, with a sergeant and a few soldiers, went to explore the country. They pushed their way through the thickets till they were stopped by a marsh choked with reeds, at the edge of which, under a great laurel tree, they had seated themselves to rest, overcome with the summer heat, when 5 Indians suddenly appeared, peering timidly at them from among the bushes. Some of the men went towards them with signs of friendship, on which, taking heart, they drew near, and one of them, who was evidently a chief, made a long speech, inviting the strangers to their dwellings. The way was across the marsh, through which they carried the lieutenant and 2 or 3 of the soldiers on their backs, while the rest circled by a narrow path through the woods. When they reached the lodges, a crowd of Indians came out, to receive our men gallantly and feast them after their manner. One of them brought a large earthen vessel full of spring water, which was served out to each in turn in a wooden cup. But what most astonished the French was a venerable chief, who assured them that he was the father of 5 successive generations, and that he had lived 250 years. Opposite sat a still more ancient veteran, the father of the first, shrunken to a mere anatomy, and seeming to be rather a dead carcass than a living body. Also, pursues the history, his age was so great that the good man had lost his sight, and could not speak one only word, but with exceeding great pain. In spite of his dismal condition, the visitors were told that he might expect to live, in the course of nature, 30 or 40 years more. As the 2 patriarchs sat face to face, half hidden with their streaming white hair, Ottigny and his credulous soldiers looked from one to the other, lost in speechless admiration. One of these veterans made a parting present to his guests of 2 young eagles, and Ottigny and his followers returned to report what they had seen. Laudonniere was waiting for them on the side of the hill, and now he says, "I went right to the top thereof, where we found nothing else but cedars, palm, and bay trees, of so sovereign odour that balm smelleth nothing like in comparison." From this high standpoint they surveyed their Canaan. The unruffled river lay before them, with its marshy islands overgrown with sedge and bulrushes, while on the farther side the flat green meadows spread mile on mile, veined with countless creeks and belts of torpid water, and bounded leagues away by the verge of the dim pine forest. On the right the sea glistened along the horizon, and on the left the St. Johns stretched westward between verdant shores, a highway to their fancied El Dorado. "Briefly," writes Laudonniere, "the place is so pleasant that those which are melancholic would be enforced to change their humour." On their way back to the ships they stopped for another parley with the chief Satouriona, and Laudonniere eagerly asked where he had got the wedge of silver that he gave him in the morning. The chief told him by signs that he had taken it in war from a people called Timagoas, who lived higher up the river, and who were his mortal enemies, on which the French captain had the folly to promise that he would join in an expedition against them. Satouriona was delighted, and declared that, if he kept his word, he should have gold and silver to his heart's content. Man and nature alike seemed to mark the borders of the River of May as the site of the new colony, for here, around the Indian towns, the harvests of maize, beans, and pumpkins promised abundant food, while the river opened a ready way to the mines of gold and silver and the stores of barbaric wealth which glittered before the dreaming vision of the colonists. Yet, the better to satisfy himself and his men, Laudonniere weighed anchor and sailed for a time along the neighbouring coasts. Returning, confirmed in his first impression, he set out with a party of officers and soldiers to explore the borders of the chosen stream. The day was hot. The sun beat fiercely on the woolen caps and heavy doublets of the men, till at length they gained the shade of one of those deep forests of pine, where the dead-hot air is thick with resinous odours, and the earth, carpeted with fallen leaves, gives no sound beneath the foot. Yet in the stillness deer leaped up on all sides as they moved along. Then they emerged into sunlight. A meadow was before them, a running brook, and a wall of encircling forest. The men called it the Vale of Laudonniere. The afternoon was spent, and the sun was near its setting when they reached the bank of the river. They strewed the ground with boughs and leaves, and, stretched on that sylvan couch, slept the sleep of travel-worn and weary men. They were roused at daybreak by sound of trumpet, and after singing a psalm they set themselves to their task. It was the building of a fort, and the spot they chose was a furlong or more above St. Johns Bluff, where close to the water was a wide, flat knoll, raised a few feet above the marsh and the river. Boats came up the stream with labourers, tents, provisions, cannon, and tools. The engineers marked out the work in the form of a triangle, and, from the noble volunteer to the meanest artisan, all lent a hand to complete it. On the riverside the defences were a palisade of timber. On the two other sides were a ditch and a rampart of fascines, earth, and sods. At each angle was a bastion, in one of which was the magazine. Within was a spacious parade. Around it were various buildings for lodging and storage, and a large house with covered galleries was built on the side towards the river for Laudonniere and his officers. In honour of Charles IX, the fort was named Fort Caroline. Meanwhile, Satouriona, lord of all that country, as the narratives style him, was seized with misgivings on learning these proceedings. The work was scarcely begun, and all was din and confusion around the incipient fort, when the startled Frenchman saw the neighbouring height of St. John's swarming with naked warriors. Laudonniere set his men in array, and for a season pick and spade were dropped for arquebus and pike. The savage chief descended to the camp. The artist, Lemoyne, who saw him, drew his likeness from memory. A tall, athletic figure, tattooed in token of his rank, plumed, bedecked with strings of beads, and girdled with tinkling pieces of metal which hung from the belt which formed his only garment. He came in regal state, a crowd of warriors around him, and in advance a troop of young Indians armed with spears. 20 musicians followed, blowing hideous discord through pipes of reeds, while he seated himself on the ground, like a monkey, as Lemoyne has it in the grave Latin of his Brevis Narratario. A council followed, in which broken words were aided by signs and pantomime, and a treaty of alliance was made, Laudonniere renewing his rash promise to aid the chief against his enemies. Satouriona, well pleased, ordered his Indians to help the French in their work. They obeyed with alacrity, and in 2 days the buildings of the fort were all thatched after the native fashion with leaves of the palmetto. These savages belonged to one of the confederacies into which the native tribes of Florida were divided, and with 3 of which the French came into contact. The first was that of Satouriona, and the second was that of the people called Timagoas, who, under a chief named Utina, dwelt in 40 villages high up the St. Johns. The third was that of the chief, Cacique, or Paracousi, whom the French called King Potanu, and whose dominions lay among the pine barrens, cypress swamps, and fertile hummocks westward and northwestward of this remarkable river. These 3 confederacies hated each other, and were constantly at war. Their social state was more advanced than that of the wandering hunter tribes. They were an agricultural people, and around all their villages were fields of maize, beans, and pumpkins. The harvest was gathered into a public granary, and they lived on it during 3/4 of the year, dispersing in winter to hunt among the forests. They were exceedingly well formed. The men, or the principal among them, were tattooed on the limbs and body, and in summer were nearly naked. Some wore their straight black hair flowing loose to the waist, others gathered it in a knot at the crown of the head. They danced and sang about the scalps of their enemies, like the tribes of the north, and like them they had their medicine men, who combined the functions of physicians, sorcerers, and priests. The most prominent feature of their religion was sun worship. Their villages were clusters of large dome-shaped huts, framed with poles and thatched with palmetto leaves. In the midst was the dwelling of the chief, much larger than the rest, and sometimes raised on an artificial mound. They were enclosed with palisades, and, strange to say, some of them were approached by wide avenues, artificially graded, and several hundred yards in length. Traces of these may still be seen, as may also the mounds in which the Floridians, like the Hurons and various other tribes, collected at stated intervals the bones of their dead. Social distinctions were sharply defined among them. Their chiefs, whose office was hereditary, sometimes exercised a power almost absolute. Each village had its chief, subordinate to the grand chief of the confederacy. In the language of the French narratives, they were all kings or lords, vassals of the great monarch Satouriona, Utina, or Potanu. All these tribes are now extinct, and it is difficult to ascertain with precision their tribal affinities. There can be no doubt that they were the authors of the aboriginal remains at present found in various parts of Florida. Having nearly finished the fort, Laudonniere declares that he would not lose the minute of an hour without employing of the same in some virtuous exercise, and he therefore sent his lieutenant, Ottigny, to spy out the secrets of the interior, and to learn, above all, what this Timagoa might be, whereof the Paracousi Satouriona had spoken to us so often. As Laudonniere stood pledged to attack the Timagoas, the chief gave Ottigny 2 Indian guides, who, says the record, were so eager for the fray that they seemed as if bound to a wedding feast. The lazy waters of the St. Johns, tinged to coffee color by the exudations of the swamps, curled before the prow of Ottigny's sailboat, as he advanced into the prolific wilderness which no European eye had ever yet beheld. By his own reckoning, he sailed 30 leagues up the river, which would have brought him to a point not far below Palataka. Here, more than 2 centuries later, the Bartrams, father and son, guided their skiff and kindled their nightly bivouac fire, and here, too, roamed Audubon, with his sketch-book and his gun. It was a paradise for the hunter and the naturalist. Earth, air, and water teemed with life, in endless varieties of beauty and ugliness. A half-tropical forest shadowed the low shores, where the palmetto and the cabbage palm mingled with the oak, the maple, the cypress, the liquid ambar, the laurel, the myrtle, and the broad, glistening leaves of the evergreen magnolia. Here was the haunt of bears, wild cats, lynxes, cougars, and the numberless deer of which they made their prey. In the sedges and the mud the alligator stretched his brutish length, Turtles with outstretched necks basked on half-sunken logs. The rattlesnake sunned himself on the sandy bank, and the yet more dangerous moccasin lurked under the water lilies in inlets and sheltered coves. The air and the water were populous as the earth. The river swarmed with fish, from the fierce and restless gar cased in his horny armor to the lazy catfish in the muddy depths. There were the golden eagle and the white-headed eagle, the gray pelican and the white pelican, the blue heron and the white heron, the egret, the ibis, ducks of various sorts, the whooping crane, the black vulture, and the cormorant. And when at sunset the voyagers drew their boat upon the strand and built their camp-fire under the arches of the woods, the owls whooped around them all night long. And when morning came, the sultry mists that wrapped the river were vocal with the clamor of wild turkeys. When Ottigny was about 20 leagues from Fort Caroline, his 2 Indian guides, who were always on the watch, descried 3 canoes, and in great excitement cried, "Timagoa! Timagoa!" As they drew near, one of them snatched up a halberd and the other a sword, and in their fury they seemed ready to jump into the water to get at the enemy. To their great disgust, Ottigny permitted the Timagoas to run their canoes ashore and escape to the woods. Far from keeping Laudonniere's senseless promise to fight them, he wished to make them friends, to which end he now landed with some of his men, placed a few trinkets in their canoes, and withdrew to a distance to watch the result. The fugitives presently returned step by step, and allowed the French to approach them, on which Ottigny asked by signs if they had gold or silver. They replied that they had none, but that if he would give them one of his men, they would show him where it was to be found. One of the soldiers boldly offered himself for the venture, and embarked with them. As, however, he failed to return according to agreement, Ottigny on the next day followed 10 leagues farther up the stream, and at length had the good luck to see him approaching in a canoe. He brought little or no gold, but reported that he had heard of a certain chief named Myra, marvelously rich, who lived 3 days' journey up the river, and with these welcome tidings Ottigny went back to Fort Caroline. A fortnight later an officer named Vasseur went up the river to pursue the adventure. The fever for gold had seized upon the French. As the villages of the Timagoas lay between them and the imagined treasures, they shrank from a quarrel, and Laudonniere repented already of his promised alliance with Satouriona. Vasseur was 2 days' sail from the fort when 2 Indians hailed him from the shore, inviting him to their dwellings. He accepted their guidance, and presently saw before him the cornfields and palisades of an Indian town. He and his followers were led through the wondering crowd to the lodge of Malua, the chief, seated in the place of honor and plentifully regaled with fish and bread. The repast over, Malua made a speech. He told him that he was one of the 40 vassal chiefs of the great Otina, lord of all the Timagoas, whose warriors wore armor of gold and silver plate. He told them, too, of Potanu, his enemy, a man cruel in war, and of the 2 kings of the distant Appalachian mountains, Onotheaqua and Hoostaqua, great lords and abounding in riches. While thus, with earnest pantomime and broken words, the chief discoursed with his guests, Vasseur, intent and eager, strove to follow his meaning, and no sooner did he hear of these Appalachian treasures than he promised to join Utina in war against the 2 potentates of the mountains. Malua, well pleased, promised that each of Utina's vassal chiefs should requite their French allies with a heap of gold and silver 2 feet high. Thus, while Laudonniere stood pledged to Satouriona, Vasseur made alliance with his mortal enemy. On his return he passed a night in the lodge of one of Satouriona's chiefs, who questioned him touching his dealings with the Timagoas. Vasseur replied that he had set upon them and put them to utter rout, but as the chief, seeming as yet unsatisfied, continued his inquiries, the sergeant, Francois de la Caille, drew his sword, and, like Falstaff, re-enacted his deeds of valor, pursuing and thrusting at the imaginary Timagoas as they fled before his fury. The chief, at length convinced, led the party to his lodge, and entertained them with a decoction of the herb called cassina. Satouriona, elated by Laudonniere's delusive promises of aid, had summoned his so-called vassals to war. 10 chiefs and some 500 warriors had mustered at his call, and the forest was alive with their bivouacs. When all was ready, Satouriona reminded the French commander of his pledge, and claimed its fulfilment, but got nothing but evasions in return. He stifled his rage, and prepared to go without his fickle ally. A fire was kindled near the bank of the river, and 2 large vessels of water were placed beside it. Here Satouriona took his stand, while his chiefs crouched on the grass around him, and the savage visages of his 500 warriors filled the outer circle, their long hair garnished with feathers, or covered with the heads and skins of wolves, cougars, bears, or eagles. Satouriona, looking towards the country of his enemy, distorted his features into a wild expression of rage and hate, then muttered to himself, then howled an invocation to his god, the sun, then besprinkled the assembly with water from one of the vessels, and turning the other upon the fire, suddenly quenched it. "So," he cried, "may the blood of our enemies be poured out, and their lives extinguished!" And the concourse gave forth an explosion of responsive yells, till the shores resounded with the wolfish din. The rites over, they set out, and in a few days returned exulting, with 13 prisoners and a number of scalps. These last were hung on a pole before the royal lodge, and when night came it brought with it a pandemonium of dancing and whooping, drumming and feasting. A notable scheme entered the brain of Laudonniere, resolved, cost what it might, to make a friend of Utina. He conceived it to be a stroke of policy to send back to him 2 of the prisoners. In the morning he sent a soldier to Satouriona to demand them. The astonished chief gave a fiat refusal, adding that he owed the French no favours, for they had shamefully broken faith with him. On this, Laudonniere, at the head of 20 soldiers, proceeded to the Indian town, placed a guard at the opening of the great lodge, entered with his arquebusiers, and seated himself without ceremony in the highest place. Here, to show his displeasure, he remained in silence for half an hour. At length he spoke, renewing his demand. For some moments Satouriona made no reply. Then he coldly observed that the sight of so many armed men had frightened the prisoners away. Laudonniere grew peremptory, when the chief's son, Athor, went out, and presently returned with the 2 Indians, whom the French led back to Fort Caroline. Satouriona, says Laudonniere, was wonderfully offended with his bravado, and bethought himself by all means how he might be revenged of us. He dissembled for the time, and presently sent 3 of his followers to the fort with a gift of pumpkins, though under this show of good will the outrage rankled in his breast, and he never forgave it. The French had been unfortunate in their dealings with the Indians. They had alienated old friends in vain attempts to make new ones. Vasseur, with the Swiss ensign Arlac, a sergeant, and 10 soldiers, went up the river early in September to carry back the 2 prisoners to Utina. Laudonniere declares that they sailed 80 leagues, which would have carried them far above Lake Monroe, but it is certain that his reckoning is grossly exaggerated. Their boat crawled up the hazy St. Johns, no longer a broad lake-like expanse, but a narrow and tortuous stream, winding between swampy forests or through the vast savannah, a verdant sea of brushes and grass. At length they came to a village called Mirepoix, and thence with the help of their oars made their way to another cluster of wigwams, apparently on a branch of the main river. Here they found Utina himself, whom, prepossessed with ideas of feudality, they regarded as the suzerain of a host of subordinate lords and princes, ruling over the surrounding swamps and pine barrens. Utina gratefully received the 2 prisoners whom Laudonniere had sent to propitiate him, feasted the wonderful strangers, and invited them to join him on a raid against his rival, Potanu. Laudonniere had promised to join Satouriona against Outina, and Vasseur now promised to join Outina against Pottineau, the hope of finding gold being in both cases the source of this impolitic compliance. Vasseur went back to Fort Caroline with 5 of the men, and left Arlac with the remaining 5 to fight the battles of Outina. The warriors mustered to the number of some 200, and the combined force of white men and red took up their march. The wilderness through which they passed has not yet quite lost its characteristic features, the bewildering monotony of the pine barrens, with their myriads of bare gray trunks and their canopy of perennial green, through which a scorching sun throws spots and streaks of yellow light, here on an undergrowth of dwarf palmetto, and there on dry sands half hidden by tufted wiregrass, and dotted with the little mounds that mark the burrows of the gopher, or those oases in the desert, the hummocks, with their wild redundant vegetation, their entanglement of trees, bushes, and vines, their scent of flowers and song of birds, or the broad sunshine of the savanna, where they waded to the neck in grass, or the deep swamp, where out of the black and root-encumbered slough rise the huge buttressed trunks of the southern cypress, the gray Spanish moss drooping from every bough and twig, wrapping its victims like a drapery of tattered cobwebs, and slowly draining away their life, for even plants devour each other and play their silent parts in the universal tragedy of nature. The Allies held their way through forest, savanna, and swamp, with Outina's Indians in the front, till they neared the hostile villages, when the modest warriors fell to the rear and yielded the post of honor to the Frenchmen. An open country lay before them, with rough fields of maize, beans, and pumpkins, and the palisades of an Indian town. Their approach was seen, and the warriors of Pottenon swarmed out to meet them, but the sight of the bearded strangers, the flash and report of the firearms, and the fall of their foremost chief, shot through the brain by Arlac, filled them with consternation, and they fled within their defenses. Pursuers and pursued entered pell-mell together. The place was pillaged and burned, its inmates captured or killed, and the victors returned triumphant. End of Chapter 4. Recording by James O'Connor. Randolph, Massachusetts, July 2009.